Hello everyone and happy Solstice from Wild Heart Nature School. We wanted to reach out and connect with you all in this time where the days are very short but they're beginning to lengthen, and we wanted to share with you a brief story because this is the time of year in our classes where we share a lot of stories with our students. And next week, I guess the week after next week, when we do our Wild Heart winter break camp, we're going to be sharing a new story every day, and they'll be very long and elaborate, and we're going to have a lot of fun with them. And these are stories that are original to us. They're inspired by lots of different sources. And this one that we have today is a much shorter version than we normally tell, but we're going to try and condense it for you and give you just the good tidbits. And it was inspired by some stories from my ancestors and a lot of European tales of the winter solstice. So without further ado, we would like to bring you to a time that is not that far from where we are in this very moment, and a place that is not that far from where we are right now. And this story follows two siblings, a brother and a sister, and they live in a land that is beautiful and vast, and yet this land is going through a difficult time. Now, these two siblings live in a castle, and they're the only two that are allowed to live in this castle besides the king himself. Now, these two are the servants of the king. As far as they know, they have no parents. These two are orphans, and they've never known or asked who their parents were. They've just accepted that that's what it is, and that they are blessed to be living with the king in the first place. Now, this king is old, and he's becoming sick, and he's no longer the man he used to be. But these children hear stories from the villagers of this young, beautiful, brave and bold king who walked around with a staff that had on top of it a crystal, and on this crystal it seemed to glow with a light from within. No longer was this the case. These children had seen this staff, and instead of being a glowing crystal, it seemed to be somewhat dull, somewhat opaque, but you could still see through it, but no longer did it glow. So they only knew this old king that they lived with now, but they heard stories of a much different one. And it was reputed that when this king walked across the land as he used to do every day, wherever he stepped, the plants would grow. Wherever this staff touched, it was as if the vines could only do nothing but crawl up it, as if there was a compulsion within them to live and be brought to life. But no longer was he able to walk across this land. He had become so old and weak. His army had become old and tired themselves because there was a drought, a horrible drought over the land that nothing would grow within. All the plants that once thrived had turned to dust, and the children became worried for their king. So the siblings set off one morning and ventured to the woods at the far edge of the kingdom, for they wanted to see how far this drought reached and if there was somewhere or someone who could help them. When they reached the edge of this forest, they stepped inside and noticed how dark it was, for the light could not even filter through this thick forest. This forest which, according to legend, was grown by the king walking on the edge of his kingdom. And as they got deeper and deeper into this forest, they noticed the smell of smoke. And the smoke drew them further and further until they could see it, wisping through the forest, leading to a cabin that appeared to be covered in a white blanket, almost as if it had snowed, but there was no snow around. And as they neared closer to this cabin, the door opens, and out peers the most beautiful woman either of them had ever seen, a gorgeous, tall maiden who wore a crown upon her head, and her hair was so bright blonde that it was hard to look at. She wore a gown of sparkling silver, as if the light which could not penetrate the forest was called and beckoned to her beauty and glistened off of this gown. And this woman invited them inside. And as they stepped inside, they noticed there was a fire burning, and yet somehow it felt chilly inside of this cabin, which was very strange because all they had felt for many, many, many days was the oppressive heat of the drought. And they told this woman what they were doing, what was happening to their king, and what was happening to the kingdom. And this woman replied with the most amazing story. She informed them that she was their mother, and that she had been banished when they were born to live in the woods, and that the king needed to be overthrown. And so the children were given the task of helping this woman, helping this queen return to power. The only thing they had to do was betray the king, and they would do so by lowering the gates, because the castle was so huge and vast that even this queen's army could not penetrate its walls. But if the children helped, she could overthrow the weak king and bring balance to the kingdom again. The one thing she told them was that if they left and helped her, when she returned to power, if she ever became sick, if she ever became old, they would need to return to the cabin for a specific purpose. So the children thought this over, and though they loved their king, they knew they were in dire straits, and so they agreed to do it on one condition, that the king would not be harmed when he was overthrown. The queen happily agreed and sent them back. The children returned to the castle, and the next morning they awoke to see emerging from the forest an incredible sight, an army of men and women dressed in white, riding white stallions, and a queen leading them in a beautiful silvery gown, in a chariot of what appeared to be ice. And as this ice queen rode to the castle, the old king stood on top and peered down, knowing that they could not penetrate his walls, until he heard the noise.